flames swallowed my home that night, I thought I had lost everything. My memories, my peace, my life's work. The fire raged so fiercely that even the firefighters could only watch as my home turned to ashes. The investigators called it suspicious, but I already knew who had done it. Karen, the head of the HOA, had threatened me countless times for ruining the neighborhood with my renovations. But burning my house? That was beyond anything I could imagine. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just any homeowner. I had spent years working in law enforcement, and this time, justice wasn't going to come quietly. When the day of her sentencing came, and she walked into the courtroom to face me, the man whose life she tried to destroy, the look on her face said everything. She finally realized who I was. It was one of those quiet nights when the world seemed completely still. The moon hung high over the neighborhood, and the soft hum of crickets was the only sound that filled the air. I had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day working on my house renovations. Ever since moving into this community, I'd been trying to make the old property feel like home again. Painting walls, fixing the fence, planting new trees. But to my neighbors, especially the head of the HOA, Karen, every small change I made was a violation. She always found something to complain about, whether it was the color of my shutters or the fact that I parked my truck in the driveway instead of the garage. I'd learned to ignore her until that night. A faint crackling sound woke me. At first I thought it was the wind rattling the window, but then came the smell, thick, suffocating smoke creeping under the door. I shot up coughing and saw a flickering orange glow spilling across the hallway. My stomach dropped. Fire. I grabbed my phone and bolted toward the front door, shouting for my dog Max. He barked from the back room, panicked. The smoke thickened fast, stinging my eyes, making it hard to breathe. I wrapped my shirt around my mouth, grabbed Max by the collar, and pushed through the heat. The moment I stepped outside, I turned back. Flames were already swallowing the roof. The night sky turned red. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, phones in hand, watching as my house became an inferno. Someone called 911, and within minutes, sirens screamed down the road. Fire trucks pulled up, spraying water that hissed and steamed, but the blaze was too strong. I stood barefoot on the pavement, shivering despite the heat. Everything I owned, photographs, furniture, the tools I'd collected over years, was gone in minutes. The smell of burning wood and melting plastic filled the air. My chest ached with disbelief. Then I saw her, Karen. She stood across the street, arms crossed, her silk robe shining under the firelight. There was no panic in her face, no sympathy, just a cold, satisfied expression. When our eyes met, she smirked. "Maybe next time you'll follow community rules," she said softly, just loud enough for me to hear, before turning and walking back into her house. I froze. The words hit me like a punch. For weeks, she had been threatening to handle me if I didn't stop ruining the neighborhood with my so-called unapproved construction, but I never imagined she'd take it this far. The fire chief approached me as the last flames died out. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly, "but it's a total loss." I nodded, numb. He asked a few routine questions. Did I have enemies? Had I smelled gas? Did I notice anything unusual before the fire? My mind replayed Karen's smirk, the way she'd said those words. I hesitated but finally said, "You might want to talk to someone from the HOA. The chief frowned slightly, but he wrote it down. By morning, my property was nothing but a blackened skeleton. The insurance investigator arrived, walking carefully through the ashes, collecting samples. "We found traces of accelerant," he told me. "This wasn't an accident." My jaw tightened. I'd known it all along, but hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. The police asked for a list of people who might have had a grudge against me. I only gave them one name, Karen Mitchell, the president of the Homeowners Association. When the officers went to question her, she played her part perfectly. She cried, said she was heartbroken for me, and insisted she'd been home all night. I wasn't surprised. Karen was good at pretending. She had built her little kingdom in this neighborhood by bullying everyone into submission, writing fines for lawns that were too tall, threatening families for painting their fences, even calling the cops on kids for riding bikes too fast. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just another quiet homeowner. I had a background she couldn't even begin to imagine. Before retiring, I'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement. I knew how to find the truth, and I knew how people like her thought. That night, I drove past her house. Her lights were on. Through the window, I saw her sipping wine, laughing with someone on the phone, probably bragging about how she'd solved the problem. My fists clenched on the steering wheel. The sight of her enjoying her evening while I stood homeless made something inside me harden. This wasn't just about a burned house anymore, it was about justice. I parked nearby and looked around. A neighbor across the street had one of those new doorbell cameras. If it had been recording that night, it might have captured something useful. I made a note to visit them in the morning. If there was one thing I learned from my years in investigation, it was that criminals always leave a trace. And Karen, in her arrogance, probably thought no one would ever look too closely. As I drove to the motel where I'd be staying, I looked back one last time at the smoldering remains of my home. The flames were gone, but they'd left behind something stronger, a fire burning inside me. I wasn't going to rest until the truth came out. I didn't care how long it took, or what it cost. Karen thought she'd destroyed my life that night, but she had only started a war she could never win. The morning after the fire felt colder than usual. The sun rose slowly over the charred remains of my house, throwing long shadows across the blackened ground. The air still carried that bitter, acrid smell of smoke. Every step I took crunched on ashes that used to be my life. The old wooden floors, the pictures of my parents, the furniture I built myself. But beneath the sadness, I felt something else growing stronger. Determination. Karen thought she could scare me into leaving. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 2 investigators from the fire department returned that morning, marking spots with flags and collecting debris for testing. I stood beside them, silent, watching their every move. One of them, a younger man named Ryan, crouched near what was left of my garage. "Looks like the fire started here," he said, brushing away some soot. "Do you have any gas or chemicals stored in this area?" "Nothing like that," I replied. "Just tools and paint cans. Nothing that would ignite like this." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "We found signs of accelerant along the base. Someone spread it deliberately." The older investigator, a woman named Detective Harlow, looked up at me with serious eyes. "We'll run full lab tests, but this doesn't look accidental. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Those words hit me hard. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a calculated attack. My mind immediately went back to Karen's face, the smug satisfaction when she told me, "Maybe next time you'll follow community rules." After the investigators left, I decided to follow my own instincts. I started by visiting my neighbor across the street, an older man named Bill. He had one of those new security doorbell cameras. When I explained what happened, he was quick to help. "Of course I'll check the footage," he said, scrolling through his phone. After a few minutes, he froze. "Wait, there's something here." He handed me his phone. On the screen, the timestamp showed 11:43 p.m., about 20 minutes before the fire started. A dark SUV had pulled into my driveway. The headlights flickered off, and a figure stepped out carrying what looked like a canister. Even in the dim light, I recognized the silhouette instantly. Karen's short blonde hair, and the distinct outline of her long coat. She wore it almost every day. The camera even caught the reflection of her license plate for a moment. I paused the footage and stared at it. My jaw clenched. That was all I needed. "Bill," I said quietly, "you've just helped catch an arsonist." He nodded gravely. "I never liked that woman. She thinks she runs this whole place." I thanked him, made a copy of the footage, and drove straight to the police department. The officer at the front desk raised his eyebrows when I showed him the video. Within minutes, Detective Harlow came out from her office. I explained everything. The threats, the fines, the harassment, and now this footage. She watched the clip twice, then looked up at me. "That's pretty damning," she said. "We'll bring her in for questioning." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the stiff motel bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. Karen must have thought she'd be untouchable. As HOA president, she controlled everything in that neighborhood. The rules, the complaints, even which contractors people could hire. But she didn't count on me being someone who used to chase people like her for a living. I wasn't the kind of man to back down, and she was about to learn that. The next morning, the police questioned her. From what I heard, she denied everything, said she was home asleep, that she'd never hurt anyone. She even tried to twist it, claiming I was targeting her because she enforced the HOA's regulations. Classic Karen move. But her confidence didn't last long. Detective Harlow called me later that day to say they found something else. During a search of Karen's property, they discovered a nearly empty gasoline container in her garage, the same brand and size as the one used in my fire. When confronted, she claimed it was for her lawnmower, but the timing was too convenient. The investigators sent it for forensic testing to match chemical residues from my house. I knew the results would seal her fate. Still, waiting for justice tested every ounce of my patience. A few days later, I went back to the ruins of my home. I needed to see it one more time before the cleanup crews arrived. I walked through what was left of the living room, my boots leaving tracks in the ash. The fireplace was barely standing. My old leather chair was nothing but a frame. But as I stood there, something caught my eye. A small piece of metal buried under the debris. I knelt and picked it up. It was a part of a lighter, burned but still recognizable, the kind you'd buy in a pack from the gas station down the street. I put it in a bag and called Harlow. When she examined it, she confirmed it had traces of the same fuel compound found near the point of ignition. Another piece of evidence tying Karen to the scene. It felt like every clue she'd left behind was coming back to crush her. That night, sitting alone in my car, I thought about everything I'd lost. My home, my comfort, my sense of safety. But strangely, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt focused. I'd seen too many criminals think they could outsmart the law. They always made the same mistake thinking no one would ever catch them. Karen was no different. The day they arrested her, I was standing across the street. Police cars lined her driveway, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off her windows. She stood on her porch in her robe again, this time not smirking. For once, she looked small, powerless. When they led her away in handcuffs, she glanced at me, her face twisted in disbelief. She still didn't know who I really was. I gave her one last look, calm and steady. I didn't have to say anything. The truth was already burning her life down, just like she'd burned mine. The news of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By morning, everyone was talking about it. The once powerful HOA president, who'd ruled the streets with her clipboard and complaints, was now sitting in a police cell. Some neighbors were shocked, others quietly relieved. For years, they'd all endured her petty fines, threats, and endless violation letters, but few dared to challenge her. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control, and losing it was something she never imagined. I drove past the neighborhood that day, looking at the same houses that used to feel like home. The yellow tape still stretched across my property, warning people away from the charred remains. It was hard to look at, but I needed to. It reminded me why I couldn't stop until the truth was fully exposed. Karen's arrest was only the beginning. I knew how people like her operated. They always had backup plans, hidden lies, and people willing to defend them. I'd seen it all before during my years in federal investigations. Later that afternoon, Detective Harlow called me into the station to go over new evidence. When I arrived, she handed me a folder thick with reports and photographs. The lab confirmed it, she said. The accelerant residue found at your house matches the fuel in Karen's garage. The fingerprints on the gas can are hers. We also recovered traces of the same compound on her gloves. I felt a rush of grim satisfaction. That's solid enough to put her away for years. Almost, Harlow replied, but her attorney is pushing back hard. Claims someone framed her, that you have a personal vendetta because she reported you for code violations. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Of course she'd say that. The woman never takes responsibility for anything. She's scheduled for arraignment next week, Harlow continued. We'll need you to testify about your interactions with her. The threats, the disputes, everything. I nodded. I'll be there. When I left the station, I noticed a small crowd gathered near the courthouse steps. A local news van was parked there. The reporter talking about the HOA president accused of burning down a homeowner's house. I watched from a distance as they replayed the doorbell footage. Seeing Karen's SUV pull into my driveway on that tiny screen sent chills down my spine again. She had really done it. Driven to my home in the middle of the night, doused it in gasoline, and walked away while I slept inside. It was the kind of evil you could never truly understand. That evening, I stopped by a nearby diner. It was a place I used to visit often before everything went up in smoke. The waitress, Mary, recognized me immediately. Heard about what happened, she said softly. You hanging in there? I've been better, I admitted, but the truth's finally coming out. She sighed. Karen always gave everyone a hard time. You're doing what nobody else could, standing up to her. Her words stuck with me. Maybe that was true. Maybe this wasn't just about my house anymore. Maybe it was about every person she had bullied, fined, or humiliated just because she could. I'd seen it too many times in my line of work. People like Karen hiding behind rules and titles, thinking they were above consequences, but they all cracked eventually. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep again. I kept replaying that moment outside my burning house. Her voice, her smirk, something about it gnawed at me. There had to be more to her motive than just spite. Burning down a house wasn't an impulsive act. It took planning, courage, and desperation. I decided to dig deeper. The next day, I paid a visit to the county records office. Using my credentials as a former federal agent, I accessed the HOA's financial filings. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 2 years, Karen had been moving large sums of money out of the HOA's maintenance budget into a community improvement fund. But there was no record of any projects being completed. The paper trail was sloppy, but clear enough to show embezzlement, and the timing was suspicious. The audit I had requested from the HOA, the one Karen denied me weeks before the fire, was scheduled to begin the same week my house burned down. It suddenly made sense. She hadn't just burned my home because she hated me, she did it because she feared I'd expose her theft. The fire wasn't revenge. It was a cover-up. I took the documents straight to Harlow. She flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. This changes everything, she said. She's not just facing arson charges now. This is fraud, theft, and destruction of evidence. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. She thought she could silence me forever. Harlow gave me a small smile. Instead, she handed you the proof that will bury her. Over the next few days, the story exploded across local news. HOA president, arrested for arson and fraud, the headlines read. Neighbors began coming forward with their own stories. Overcharged fees, missing payments, false citations. The community she once controlled was turning against her. When the police brought Karen into court for her preliminary hearing, she looked different, no longer the polished, confident woman who strutted through neighborhood meetings. Her hair was disheveled, her expression tight and nervous. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, quietly watching. When her lawyer glanced in my direction, I could tell she hadn't expected to see me there. But the moment our eyes met, I saw it, that flicker of recognition, and then fear. She finally realized this wasn't just a civil complaint or a neighborhood feud. This was a criminal case she couldn't bully her way out of. The judge read the charges: arson, insurance fraud, and now, financial embezzlement. Karen's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she didn't speak. She couldn't. Her empire of control had crumbled, and I was there to watch it fall. As I left the courthouse, the air felt lighter, but deep inside, I knew this wasn't over yet. The trial was coming, and with it, the moment she would have to face the full weight of what she'd done. She had destroyed my home, but she couldn't destroy my resolve. The mask she wore for years was cracking, and soon, everyone would see what hid beneath it. The courthouse was packed the morning Karen's trial began. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as the police van arrived with her inside. The same woman who once strutted around our neighborhood barking orders at everyone, now had her hands cuffed and her head lowered. The news trucks lined the block, and people whispered her name as though it had turned into some kind of dark legend. I stood at the entrance watching quietly, dressed in a plain suit. I didn't want attention. I just wanted justice. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Karen sat at the defense table, wearing a neat gray suit instead of her usual silk robes and pearls. Her hair was tied back, her face pale and tired. But even from across the room, I could see the fire still flickering in her eyes, that desperate, hateful arrogance that never seemed to fade. She glanced at me once, and for a second, the mask cracked. Fear it was faint, but it was there. The prosecutor began by presenting the arson evidence, the gasoline traces, the fingerprints, the footage showing her SUV at my driveway, and the forensic match between the fuel used in the fire and the can found in her garage. Every piece fit perfectly together. The jury sat frozen, watching as photos of my burned home flashed across the screen, the charred remains of the walls, the melted frame of my tools, the spot where my bedroom once stood. It was all there. When my turn came to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The courtroom fell silent. I told them everything, the months of harassment, the threats, the fines, and how Karen had made my life miserable since the day I moved in. I described that night in detail, the smoke, the flames, and her standing there afterward, smirking as my home burned. My voice didn't shake, but my chest felt tight the whole time. The defense attorney tried to twist it, suggesting I was exaggerating or holding a grudge. He asked about my background, and I answered honestly that I'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement before retiring. The courtroom murmured. Karen's attorney tried to imply I might be framing her out of personal revenge, but when the prosecutor played the footage of her SUV pulling into my driveway, the room went silent again. No one could deny what they saw. Then came the bombshell, the financial documents. The prosecutor revealed how Karen had embezzled thousands of dollars from the HOA, transferring funds to her personal account under fake project names. The timing lined up exactly with my request for an audit, the one she tried to delay right before my house burned. It became painfully clear that she had tried to destroy the evidence, and me along with it. As the witnesses spoke, neighbors, HOA members, even the treasurer who had unknowingly signed off on her fake expenses, Karen sat stiff and motionless. But every once in a while, I caught her jaw clenching or her fingers twitching under the table. The confident woman who once controlled an entire community now looked trapped in her own lies. When the prosecutor rested the case, the defense tried to spin a story about mental stress and misunderstood motives. Karen even took the stand herself, insisting that she was innocent, that the video had been doctored, and that she was being targeted by a vindictive man. She looked at me while saying it, her eyes sharp and venomous, but I didn't respond. The evidence spoke for itself. After 2 days of testimony, closing arguments began. The prosecutor's words were calm but powerful. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of revenge and greed. The defendant burned down a man's home to protect her lies and nearly killed him in the process. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom held its breath. I sat quietly, my hands folded, staring at the floor. Hours felt like days. Karen whispered with her lawyer, her voice shaking now. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. Then the bailiff called everyone back in. The jury filed into their seats, faces serious. My heart pounded as the foreman stood and read the verdict. On the charge of arson in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of insurance fraud, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. The words echoed through the room like thunder. Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw pure disbelief wash over her face. Then came anger. She slammed her hands against the table, shouting, "This isn't over. He set me up. You'll all regret this." The judge struck his gavel sharply, demanding order. 2 officers approached her, but she kept yelling until they escorted her out in handcuffs. I sat back, finally breathing again. The weight I'd carried for months began to lift. Justice, real justice, had finally been served. The judge announced her sentencing would take place in 2 weeks. 20 years was the minimum, given the severity of the crimes. As I left the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city. Reporters rushed toward me, shouting questions, but I said nothing. I didn't want fame or sympathy. I just wanted peace. That night, I drove back to where my house once stood. The cleanup crews had cleared most of the debris, leaving an empty lot where my home used to be. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. For the first time since the fire, I felt something close to calm. The ashes were gone, but the lessons remained about resilience, about truth, and about how far someone could fall when they let power consume them. In the distance, the faint sound of crickets filled the air, just like that night when it all began. Only this time, the silence wasn't haunting, it was peaceful. Karen's fire had taken my home, but not my spirit. She had tried to destroy me, but in the end, she only burned herself. And soon, in a courtroom far from the neighborhood she once ruled, she'd have to face the man she tried to erase, not as her victim, but as the one who finally brought her to justice. The day of sentencing came sooner than I expected, but the weight of it had been sitting on my shoulders for weeks. The courthouse was quieter this time, no cameras flashing, no crowded benches. Just a handful of people who wanted to see the final chapter close. Karen sat at the defense table, no longer wearing sharp suits or expensive jewelry. The orange prison uniform she wore was plain and harsh under the courtroom lights. Her once perfect hair was now tied back simply, and her face, though still defiant, carried a hollow look. I could tell the sleepless nights had finally caught up with her. The judge entered, his robe sweeping, as he took his seat. The room stood, then fell into stillness. When the bailiff announced, "Court is now in session for the sentencing of Karen Mitchell," even the hum of the air conditioner seemed too quiet. My pulse thudded in my ears. I'd waited for this moment since the night I watched my home burn to the ground. The prosecutor began, summarizing months of evidence, the footage, the fingerprints, the financial theft, and the motive. "This defendant acted not out of panic or impulse," he said firmly, "but out of arrogance and greed. She used her power as HOA president to intimidate and control. And when exposed, she chose to destroy rather than admit fault. The victim could have lost his life that night. Today, we ask for justice. Not revenge, but justice that ensures no one else suffers from her cruelty." Then it was my turn. The judge asked if I had a statement to make. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every memory pressing on my chest. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "When my house burned, I thought I'd lost everything. But standing here today, I realized that what she tried to destroy wasn't just a home, it was my peace, my trust, and my safety. She didn't succeed in breaking me, but she burned through years of hard work, memories, and hope. I don't hate her. I just want her to understand that actions have consequences, and that power doesn't make anyone untouchable." I sat back down. The silence that followed was heavy. Karen didn't look at me, not once. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she muttered. "I just wanted him gone." He kept pushing, and I snapped. Her voice cracked. "I thought I could control everything. I was wrong." The judge studied her for a long time before speaking. "Ms. Mitchell," he said sternly, "you used authority to manipulate and destroy. You tried to cover your crimes with fire, and in doing so, you endangered lives. Justice demands accountability." He paused, then read the sentence clearly. "For arson in the first degree, 20 years in state prison. For insurance fraud and embezzlement, an additional 10 years, to be served concurrently. You are hereby remanded into custody." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. Karen's face drained of color. The bailiff stepped forward, cuffed her wrists, and led her away. As she passed by me, she finally lifted her eyes. For a fleeting moment, she looked like a completely different person, not the tyrant who once ruled our neighborhood, but a woman realizing she'd lost everything. She opened her mouth as if to say something but said nothing. The door shut behind her with a dull thud, and just like that, it was over. When I walked out of the courthouse, the air outside felt lighter than it had in months. The sun shone through a break in the clouds, and for the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath and didn't feel the weight of smoke in my lungs. I drove back to my empty lot, where the rebuilding had already begun. Wooden frames stood where the foundation had once been, and workers were setting beams under the warm afternoon light. The scent of new lumber replaced the memory of burnt wood. As I stood there, watching them work, Max, my loyal dog, ran around the open space, tail wagging. He hadn't left my side since the fire. I knelt and scratched behind his ears. "We're finally home again." "Buddy," I said softly. He barked once, as if he understood. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly rose from the ashes. Neighbors stopped by to help, some bringing meals, others offering materials, or just company. The same community Karen had tried to control was now coming together, stronger than ever. Her reign of fear had ended, replaced by kindness and cooperation. People painted their fences freely, planted gardens without asking permission, and laughed without worrying about being fined for disturbing the peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, I stood on my new porch, holding a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was alive again, kids playing, neighbors chatting, music playing faintly in the distance. For a long moment, I just listened. That peace, that hum of life, was what she had tried to take from me, and now it was mine again. Sometimes, when I pass by the old HOA office building, I still think about Karen, about how power can twist a person until they can't tell right from wrong. But I also think about how justice works in quiet, steady ways. The flames she set may have destroyed my home, but they couldn't destroy who I was. Now, as I sit in my rebuilt house surrounded by the warmth of new beginnings, I realize that the fire didn't end my story, it just rewrote it. Out of the ashes came truth, peace, and freedom. And that, I decided, was the real victory. If you found this story powerful, don't miss more gripping true life HOA stories and emotional dramas on my channel, HOA Bright Reality. For more incredible videos, like, share, comment, and subscribe to HOA Bright Reality today.